Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the place where we take a closer look at sources for you, the learner, especially in the world of reformed thinking. We sift through articles, essays, commentaries, and we try to pull out the essential insights. And today, our sources are pointing us to something, well, something really peculiar about how the Bible speaks. We're looking at these strange phrases that just sort of, stop you in your tracks, things that sound almost impossible when you first hear them in English. I'm talking about phrases like living sacrifice or being sorrowful yet always rejoicing, or Paul's just staggering claim that when I am weak, then I am strong. These aren't just, oddities, or sources say they're very calculated. So our mission today is to unpack this idea of holy tensions, these oxymorons and paradoxes. And we want to see them not as flaws or confusion in the text, but as a deliberate strategy, a way to arrest the mind, really, to humble the heart so the gospel can become clear.
That's the key right there. The world runs on a very different kind of logic.
Why?
A very simple, almost transactional logic.
How so?
Well, the world just assumes that, blessing means you have an easy life, you're wealthy, joy means there's no pain, and freedom, freedom is all about self-rule, total autonomy.
Right, doing what I want.
Exactly. But Scripture doesn't just disagree with that. It violently interrupts it. It speaks with what we could call a cross-shaped logic that flips every single one of those assumptions upside down. So these tensions, they're not just riddles for the sake of it. They're like windows into kingdom realities, realities that you just can't squeeze into our flat worldly categories. They force us to redefine words we thought we already knew.
So we have to ask a different set of questions.
We have to. What does God mean by blessing if it can include mourning? What kind of strength is actually perfected in weakness?
Okay, so let's get our tools in order. Before we dive into the big claims, we need to be precise with our language. If we're going to talk about holy tensions, we should probably define the two main things we're seeing. Let's start with the oxymoron, the more compact one. In literary terms, I guess you could call the oxymoron a kind of rhetorical spark. It's usually just two words or a very tight phrase, joining terms that seem to just cancel each other out. But the point isn't cancellation, is it? The collision is meant to create a single new idea. It's like it short-circuits your brain a little, forces you to stop and figure out a new meaning.
Yes, and the classic example from our sources, and maybe one of the most doctrinally dense, is living sacrifice from Romans 12.1. When you hear those two words, living and sacrifice, they pull against each other violently. In the Old Testament, a sacrifice was, by definition, slain. It was dead, offered on an altar.
Of course.
So to command a living sacrifice, thuzizatan, that's bringing two opposites into a very purposeful tension.
And what's the purpose? What does that tension get across that a simpler phrase would miss?
It communicates a state of consecration that is ongoing. It's continuous. It's embodied in your daily life, not just a one-off ceremony.
So it's not just something you do at the temple.
Right. If Paul had just said, hey, offer your bodies as an ongoing service to God, the force of it, the call to die to yourself, it would be lost. The oxymoron acts like a rhetorical pressure point. It's saying, you must offer yourself completely to God. That's the sacrifice part. But you have to do it all the time in your real life. That's the living part. They come together to create this whole new category of spiritual existence.
Okay, that makes sense for the oxymoron. It's a compact collision creating a new single meaning. But then you have the paradox, which people often confuse with it, but it's different in scale. What's the distinction there?
The paradox is usually bigger. It's a whole proposition, a full statement, maybe even a few clauses, not just two words smashed together. It's a claim that on the surface looks totally self-contradictory, logically absurd even.
But it's not.
But it proves to be true once you understand the author's whole theological framework. The context is everything.
So we're moving from a spark to the proposition it lights up.
Precisely. Take, when I am weak, then I am strong. That's 2 Corinthians 12.10. That's not a fusion of two terms into one thing. It's a complete, startling claim that turns our expectations on their head.
Yeah, because we expect strength to come from being capable, from having resources.
Of course. And Paul says the exact opposite. His inability becomes the very thing needed to experience God's capability. The claim is held together not by the words themselves, but by the whole theology of grace that surrounds it.
Or what about Jesus' sayings like, whoever would save his life will lose it?
But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Yes, that sounds like a riddle, right? But the solution is found when you grasp his redefinition of what life even means. It's not about temporary self-preservation. It's about eternal discipleship.
So if I'm hearing you right, the oxymoron is the rhetorical shock that compressed language to grab your attention. And the paradox is the theological proposition that the shock points to. And you need the surrounding biblical wisdom, the theological air, to resolve it and see the deeper truth. And this is so critical because as Reformed thinkers, we hold that the Bible is God's inspired word. It can't be incoherent. So we have to be careful not to celebrate genuine contradiction. Where do we draw that line? What are the guardrails here?
We have to keep saying that these holy tensions are apparent conflicts that resolve when you respect the context.
Yeah.
We're not talking about logical contradiction where A is true and not A is true in the same way at the same time.
Okay.
And we have to distinguish them from a few other rhetorical devices that can look similar but work differently.
Like what?
The first is just simple antithesis. That's just a contrast. Think of the Proverbs. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a mother's grief.
Right. They're just opposites placed side by side.
Exactly. They stay in their own lanes. But an oxymoron fuses those opposing ideas into a new unit. It's not just contrast, it's contract in unity.
Got it. And it's also not hyperbole, right? Which is just intentional exaggeration.
Correct. When Jesus says to pluck out your eye if it causes you to sin, he's using hyperbolic force to jolt someone into seeing how serious obedience is. He's stretching the literal meaning for urgency. That mechanism, exaggeration, is different from the mechanism of tension, which fuses opposites to make a new category.
And it's not irony either.
Not at all. Irony is saying one thing but meaning the opposite. You know, when Elijah is mocking the prophets of Baal, telling them to shout louder because maybe their God is busy, he's saying one thing but implying its reverse.
Yeah.
A paradox advertises its tension openly and asks you to resolve it. Irony asks you to assume the literal statement is false.
There are a couple of other distinctions that seem really important, especially for someone who might just pull a verse out of context. First, these tensions are not just ambiguity created by flattening a metaphor or yanking a phrase out of its historical setting. We see that all the time. If someone today insists that freedom can only mean modern absolute autonomy, then Paul's phrase, slave of Christ, sounds, well, it sounds nonsensical. Or even awful.
But the incoherence isn't in the text. It's in the definition you brought to the text, the worldly dictionary you're using. The tension is there to force you to throw that dictionary out.
And the final point. This isn't the same as a doctrinal mystery, like the Trinity.
That's a crucial distinction. Christianity absolutely has truths that our finite minds can't fully grasp. But the rhetorical impossibility in these phrases, like God justifying the ungodly, is actually designed to lead us into a deeper understanding of a revealed truth, like substitution. It's not meant to suspend your mind in some irrational fog. The tension is supposed to be resolved by biblical theology, not just celebrated as a permanent riddle.
That's a really helpful set of guardrails. It keeps us from just slapping the paradox label on anything that feels a bit tricky.
So what's the method then? How do we responsibly identify and interpret these? It takes discipline, which our sources stress is a hallmark of good Reformed exegesis. Step one is just to locate the semantic clash. You're reading along, and a phrase just makes you stop. It creates friction, like blessed, mourn. You're just noticing where the text puts two repelling ideas together. That's the candidate stage.
Okay, so you've identified a candidate. What's next?
Step two is to apply the semantic test. Does the clash happen in a tight unit and form a single coherent new meaning? Does bittersweet create a single new flavor? Yes. Does living sacrifice create a single new category of offering? Yes. This helps you tell the difference between a tight oxymoron and a broader paradox.
And then the third and most important step, the one that keeps us from just admiring the wordplay.
You have to resolve the tension by tracing the contextual logic. You have to ask, what is the author arguing? What problem is he trying to solve? Paul's weak, strong statement is the climax of a whole argument about grace and affliction in his ministry. It's not just some abstract thought about self-help.
And if you can't paraphrase it without losing the point,
Then you haven't resolved the tension yet. And we have to be sensitive to genre, too. The Psalms use tension differently than the epistles do. Jesus uses shock and reversal in the Beatitudes to expose self-righteousness. Paul uses paradox to argue for the cross against human boasting. The big question is always, how is the author using this tension to persuade you to accept the gospel's logic?
okay, with those tools, we can now move to the theological center of it all. Our sources are insistent that every one of these tensions points back to two huge fundamental contradictions, the Christological one and the soteriological one, the twin pillars of the gospel. Let's start with the Christological scandal. the crucified Lord. Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 1, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The ultimate original oxymoron here is Christos estauromenos, the Messiah, the anointed king, juxtaposed with crucified, the most shameful, accursed death you could imagine.
It's almost impossible for us today to feel the full weight of that collision. For a first-century Jew, the Christos was the triumphant conquering king promised in the Psalms and Isaiah. He was supposed to rescue Israel.
The conquering hero.
Yes. For that king to be put on a cross, the very symbol of the curse from Deuteronomy, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. That wasn't just a political letdown. It was theological blasphemy. It was a scandalon, a stumbling block, because it offended every religious expectation they had.
And for the Greeks.
For the Greeks, who valued reason and philosophy and stoicism, the idea of a god suffering a brutal public execution like that was just ridiculous. It was Moria foolishness, intellectual nonsense. So this one phrase, the cursed king, is like a doctrinal explosive. It shatters Jewish religious pride and Greco-Roman intellectual pride at the same time. It leaves no room for human boasting at all.
The sources also point to something deeper, even in the grammar. You're talking about the word estauromenos.
Yes, the grammar in the Greek is so specific here. Paul uses the perfect passive tense. This detail is so crucial, and frankly, it's easy to miss. He doesn't use the tense that would just say Christ was crucified, as if it were a past event he moved on from.
Wait, so the choice of tense itself carries a permanent theological meaning? What's the significance of that?
Absolutely. The perfect passive tense means the crucifixion was a real past act, but its results and consequences continue right into the present and into eternity. He isn't just the Christ who was crucified. He remains forever the crucified one.
So the cross isn't something he just left behind.
No, it's the permanent definition of his identity and his glory. In Revelation, he's the Lamb who stands as though it had been slain. The marks of his suffering aren't scars from a defeat he recovered from. They are the badges of a victory won through a completely redefined kind of power.
That single point on grammar really challenges every definition of success our culture has. So Christ's glory is actually defined by his suffering, not just something that came after it.
That is the central, unavoidable point. The cross isn't a hurdle he had to get over to get back to being powerful. It's the very method of his saving work. And it confronts any glory theology, ancient or modern, that wants blessing without weakness. It demolishes any attempt to reduce Jesus to just a moral example. The grammar insists his identity as the Christos is forever tied to the stauros, his atoning death.
And that has huge implications for the church. If the king reigns through the weakness of the cross, it refutes any kind of triumphalism that expects the church to win through worldly strength or money or success.
It forces us to abandon all of that. We're left with nothing but the cross to boast in, realizing that God's way of working is clearest when we stop relying on our own strength.
So that Christological tension, the king on the cross, that's the foundation. And flowing from that, we get the soteriological miracle, the judicial impossibility of our salvation, God justifying the ungodly.
That's Romans 4.5. And on its face, that phrase seems to tear apart the moral fabric of the universe.
You called it a judicial crisis. Why is it so jarring from an Old Testament perspective?
Because it seems to be in direct conflict with Old Testament law. Proverbs 17.15 says it plainly. He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous are both alike an abomination to the Lord.
So how can God do the very thing he calls an abomination? Doesn't that make him unjust?
That's the tension. And we have to be clear about who God is justifying. The Greek word Paul uses is astiobi, the ungodly. We can't water that down. This isn't someone who just made a few mistakes. It's someone in active, open rebellion against God.
And the text says he justifies them while they are still in that state.
Yes, that's the radical break from any religion based on merit. You don't clean yourself up first. So the question our Reformed sources answer so clearly is, how does a perfectly just God justify the actively unjust?
And this is where the doctrine of substitution and double imputation comes in, providing the legal solution to this paradox.
It's the heart of the gospel's logic. The Westminster Confession reflects this perfectly. God doesn't just lower his standards or look the other way. He transfers the guilty verdict that belongs to the esibo onto the sinless Christ. And at the same time, he transfers the perfect righteous verdict that belongs to Christ onto the believer. It is a glorious, legal, great exchange.
The word legal is key there. It's a forensic declaration. It's not that we suddenly become good enough, but we are declared righteous because of what someone else did.
And that's what keeps the tension intact. The resolution safeguards grace. It's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5.21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Salvation is a legal declaration based on a finished atonement, not on our moral improvement.
And that paradox, justifying the rebellious, it works as a powerful weapon, doesn't it? It's a bulwark against legalism.
It shatters it. The moralist who thinks they can bring their own good works to God has to come as ungodly to be saved. Their pride is crushed.
And what about today's more therapeutic ideas about God?
It confronts those too. The ones that redefine justification as God just recognizing our inherent worth or giving us some kind of therapy. This paradox insists that justification is a non-negotiable legal act that required a substitutionary sacrifice. Our standing before God rests entirely on Christ's righteousness, a righteousness that is alien to us, not on our feelings or performance.
So if we're saved by this ultimate contradiction, that logic has to start reshaping how we live. That brings us to the paradoxes of sanctification. We can start by going back to that living sacrifice in Romans 12.1.
Exactly. That clash between thusia, sacrifice, and zeuson, living, is meant to be profound. It's a shocking image.
And Paul calls this the only rational response to God's mercy. Not a one-time thing, but a continuous daily existence.
This is where mortification and vivification come in. The sacrifice part is the daily killing of the old man, our desire for self-rule, and the living part is the vivification, allowing the new man to live for God by the Spirit's power. You have to die to yourself every day to truly live for God.
That sounds exhausting, though. How do we keep this from becoming just another form of legalism? Hearing daily execution of the old man could just feel like another impossible burden.
That's such an important question, and the text answers it. It's all grounded in God's mercies. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. This isn't about earning merit. It's the only rational response to having already been justified while we were enemies.
So the motivation is different.
Completely. The legalist sacrifices to get mercy. The justified believer sacrifices because of mercy. It's grateful surrender, not frantic performance.
And this just obliterates the modern idol of autonomy, the idea that my life is my own.
It does. And that pattern of glory through weakness continues right into Paul's own struggle in 2 Corinthians 12. He has this thorn, he pleads for it to be removed, and the Lord's answer is just so counterintuitive. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
Made perfect in weakness. How is divine power perfected in our inability? That goes against everything we think.
It's a statement about God's methodology. The Greek word for made perfect is teletai. It means brought to its full goal or consummated. God's power isn't just present in our weakness. It's brought to its highest, most visible display when our own ability is stripped away and we are utterly dependent.
Like the jar of clay image Paul uses.
Exactly. The jar itself is cracked, unimpressive, fragile. If the jar is perfect, the treasure inside, the glory of Christ, is hidden. But it's when the vessel is cracked by affliction or weakness that the light of the treasure shines out, and no one can mistake the jar for the treasure.
So the weakness isn't a failure. It's the stage where grace does its greatest work. This is a direct assault on the prosperity gospel and any idea that success is the only sign of God's blessing.
It completely shatters it. The world's logic is capability plus resources equals success. The cross's logic is weakness plus grace equals manifest power. The thorn stays not because God is cruel, but because removing it would remove the stage for the teletai of his power. Our strength is measured by our dependence.
And this theme of coexisting opposites moves right into our emotional lives with the tension in 2 Corinthians 6.1, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. Paul describes himself as being both sorrowful and rejoicing, continuously at the same time. For anyone listening who's in real pain from loss or illness, those two states just seem impossible to hold together. How can they exist in the same heart at the same time?
This paradox defines the Christian life in the already not yet. The already is the deep, stabilizing joy of our reconciliation with God. That's secure. But that has to coexist with the not yet, the groaning of a fallen world, the presence of our own sin, the waiting for glorification. So the sorrow is real and it's legitimate. We're told to mourn with those who mourn. But the joy isn't a feeling based on our circumstances. It's a theological conviction anchored in Christ's finished work and his certain return. The joy holds us in the sorrow and keeps the sorrow from being the final word.
That has huge pastoral value. It validates honest lament. It tells people that sorrow isn't a failure of faith. It protects us from stoicism, where you just deny pain, and from despair, where pain becomes everything.
And we see it again in the same passage. Having nothing, and yet possessing all things. The early church was poor, marginalized, powerless, but as joint heirs with Christ, they possessed the title deed to the universe. We have nothing in the world, but we possess everything in Christ.
Which guards us against thinking we can have the full perfection of the kingdom right now.
It keeps our eyes fixed on what's to come. Our tears and struggles here deepen our longing for that day. It proves this world isn't our home.
Okay, let's bring this home in our final segment. How does all this high-level theology connect to our daily lives, starting with how we even read these things in our English Bibles?
Well, translation choices definitely affect the rhetorical punch, but they can't change the underlying truth.
And sometimes English can actually sharpen the tension, can't it? Phrases like living sacrifice or slave of Christ are so forceful for us because those words carry such starkly different meanings in our culture.
They do. And translators also use connectors like yet, but, and when, then, to signal that we're looking at a contrast in unity, not a flat contradiction. When Paul writes sorrowful yet always rejoicing, that little word yet is the glue holding the paradox together.
But the biggest danger for us as modern readers is the dictionary we bring to the text. We read blessed and think comfortable. We read freedom and think autonomy. When we do that, the Bible's phrases sound impossible, not because the text is incoherent, but because our cultural dictionary is wrong.
And the tension is there precisely to overthrow that false dictionary. Which brings us back to the big question, why does God speak this way at all?
What's the point of being so jarring?
Well, first, it's rhetorical. It wakes you up. A flat sentence just slides by. But a phrase that creates friction, justifying the ungodly, lodges itself in your memory. It forces you to stop and think.
But there's a deeper spiritual reason.
The deeper reason is that it humbles our pride. It denies us the comfort of thinking we already understand God's categories for what is good or strong or free. It stops the proud person in their tracks. It prepares the soil for grace, because grace only makes sense to a humble heart.
And all these paradoxes, they're just echoing the pattern of the cross itself.
Exactly. Life through death, glory through shame, victory through defeat. They are the verbal footprints of the crucified and risen Lord, training us to think his thoughts after him.
So what's the pastoral payoff? Why does knowing the difference between an oxymoron and an antithesis matter for a regular person in the church?
First, it gives us tools for endurance. Preachers can use these phrases to give their sermons clarity and the shock of unexpected truth.
And for discipleship, for counseling.
It gives us categories for perseverance. It keeps believers from swinging between denial of their pain and despair in their pain. Sorrowful yet always rejoicing just normalizes the complex reality of the Christian life.
And it serves as armor against distortions of the faith.
It does. It rebukes the prosperity gospel, which can't handle the idea that God's favor can coexist with suffering. It rebukes success-driven evangelicalism, reminding us God uses weak, unimpressive instruments so that no one can boast in human achievement.
And it rebukes therapeutic moralism.
Yes, the substitutionary tension, God justifying the ungodly, won't let the cross become just a symbol for self-acceptance. It keeps the sharp, judicial edges of the gospel intact.
So when a church really lives in this paradoxical reality that the first will be last, that we gain life by losing it, it changes the community.
It dismantles the pecking orders. It promotes humility. The living sacrifice calls everyone to offer up their whole lives, schedules, money, relationships as an act of worship. And this kind of faith, because it's so realistic about struggle and yet so hopeful in Christ, it has this strange, quiet radiance to a watching world.
So to synthesize all of this, what's the bottom line?
The synthesis is simply that all these holy tensions point back to the logic of the cross. The pattern of humiliation leading to exaltation, death leading to life. We are forced, again and again, to trade in the world's comfortable categories for God's strange, inverted ones.
The world says, protect yourself, assert your strength, and you'll live. Christ says, lose your life for my sake to find it. The world says, success proves God's approval. Scripture says, my strength is perfected in weakness.
The gospel isn't just an extension of our own reason. It's an invasion of alien grace. We have to resist the temptation to smooth out these rough edges to make it more palatable. To do that is to preach a different gospel.
So these jarring phrases, they don't leave us in a riddle. They remake our minds.
They do. They are divine chisels, reshaping us into a people who can worship and endure with the strange, steady strength of the gospel.
So here's a final thought for you to take with you. If the King of the universe, the Christos Romanos, conquered by dying, if he reigns through weakness, what impossible tension in your life right now might God be using as the precise stage to show his greatest strength?
May we live in that tension of the already and the not yet, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Soli Deo Gloria.